Why Liberalism Failed by Patrick J. Deneen is a very influential book that I found extremely compelling. It essentially talks about the fundamental flaws of liberalism that are oftentimes overlooked by most people living in a liberal democracy in the West, such as the United States of America. And so I decided that, hey, maybe I should do a book summary because I think it's a lot of really good information that should probably be out there. Okay, so I'm not going to go too much into the introduction because it essentially is a summary of the main points of the book that we're going to cover in a little bit. But he does make a few notable points. Firstly, that liberalism is the ideology is dying and it's failing in many of the promises it makes, and this is breeding a distrust in the system entirely. And ironically, it's failing because it's fulfilling itself. It's not failing because it's messing up in certain areas and that's negatively affecting it. No, it's doing well, and that's what's hurting it. And he goes more into depth in this a little bit later. But furthermore, he points out the three political ideologies of the 20th century, namely fascism, communism, and liberalism. And all of them but liberalism are dead. Fascism died roughly after World War II, communism in the 90s, and then liberalism, albeit it's dying, at least that's what he says, it's still alive. So, chapter one, he starts out discussing the definition of liberty. And he does this by contrasting the modern definition of liberty with a classical and medieval Christian definition of liberty. So the modern definition of liberty is maximizing individual autonomy, license, being able to do whatever you want to do that you feel is going to make you happy. Whereas the classical and medieval Christian definition of liberty is self-governance, which is essentially being able to do what, not what you want to do, but what you should do. Having the ability to do what you should do. Having the freedom to do what is more or less right. A good analogy to represent this would be the ship analogy. Being able to pilot your ship in the most direct and safest route to the port you want to go to without getting steered off course. And he discusses self-governance quite in depth in this chapter, and a few things he points out is that it requires virtue. Self-governance requires virtue, specifically restraint, and therefore it requires virtue-cultivating institutions. Now, a thing to note about liberalism, which he points out, is that liberalism doesn't really like the idea of aspiring to the higher things. It recognizes the reality that many people are more or less lowly when it comes to morality, but it doesn't want them to aspire to the high. So instead of practicing self-restraint, the liberal system capitalizes on vices such as greed, pride, and selfishness. And virtue is seen as unrealistic. Most people, you can't expect most people to achieve it, is what he says liberalism, believes. And liberalism despises these virtue cultivating institutions that are necessary for self-governance because it is seen as limiting individual autonomy. And again, individual autonomy is the new definition of liberty, and that's prioritized above all things by liberalism. And not only that, but liberalism is also focused on overcoming and controlling nature and our circumstances as opposed to accepting them and working with them. And this further is attached to the idea that nature limits us. Liberalism is about breaking limits, increasing that degree of license as much as possible, and that includes natural boundaries, controlling our nature and our circumstances, those things that are limiting. It wants to overcome them. And he points out in kind of a smaller part that the idea that liberalism is destroying itself is very much because it's unable to see its own mistakes. It's about self-improvement, but it can't see what it's doing is wrong and correct it, so it's essentially destroying itself. Furthermore, liberalism encourages self-interest as opposed to virtue. It encourages ignoring the common good in favor of personal gain, and also encourages homogeneity as opposed to local culture groups. And this is a theme that other political theorists have brought up when it comes to things like democracy and in actually totalitarian governments as well. The idea that they would prioritize homogenous societies as opposed to a bunch of smaller, culture groups. A big section in this chapter is dedicated to voluntarism. And liberal voluntarism is essentially, government by consent. People entering into social contracts. It's a social contract theory of Hobbes. Consent and the choice of individuals. So with a social contract theory, this is essentially defining. This is a defining factor when it comes to human nature. But it says that humans are naturally non-relational. We're not naturally we don't naturally want to be in relationships with people, but we decide to. We consent to enter into social contracts because we can benefit from it. It helps us to survive. It helps us to prosper in many times. However, liberalism, one of the things it does is it extends this way beyond things that would be acceptable. For instance, it's extended to the family. So you can decide what relationships you want to be in, and even goes as far as to marriage. With divorce, that's one of the things he notes in the book is, divorce. You don't have to stay in that marriage if you don't want to. And this idea of weak relationships, allows you to ignore obligations to society, family, and God. And he ends this section by saying that liberalism encourages loose connections, which is really a great summary of this point about liberal voluntarism. The loose connections, meaning you can sever them whenever you decide to, so that you can pursue whatever you think is going to make you happy, maximizing your license. So another thing he points out is the idea of combating nature, which was brought up a little bit earlier. So in the past, people believed in a natural order, and the people had a place in it, and people had an ultimate end, or a telos. And the natural order required a degree of conformity to it by the people in the society. And he notes that liberalism rejects this because it wants to overcome nature and master it. Because, again, nature limiting us, it doesn't want that. It doesn't want nature to limit us. It wants us to be able to overcome it so that we can, in a sense, have as much license as possible. So then he goes on to make a distinction between the types of liberals. So there's first wave and second wave liberals. The first wave liberals are what we call today conservatives, and they want to master nature through technology, but stop short of trying to master human nature through technology. They believe that's a step too far. The conservatives, would essentially be what we would call, classical liberals. And the second wave are the progressives, and they are definitely okay with mastering human nature through technology. They want to push that as far as possible. And he goes on to discuss the differences between conservatives and progressives later in the book. But he notes that liberalism is ultimately universalist and wants to transform the entire world. And this is true. So liberalism is not only going to be concerned with just the country it's present in, but it would want to naturally expand outwards into other nations. And lastly, he discusses how liberalism kind of encourages the pursuit of immediate gratification, putting your own desires before the common good. It focuses on fulfilling the basest human desires, such as greed, lust, and power. And what he notes in this part is that it's essentially a slippery slope. We want to consume, and we can be satisfied with a little bit at first, but over time we want more and more and more. And this has a dual effect of depleting the morality of people as well as the resources of nature, in effect destroying both, right? people are going to become naturally depraved because they're not fulfilling their base desires, and nature is becoming destroyed because it's running out of resources to turn into goods that people can consume. And you're seeing this with the environmental crisis that is prevalent today, as well as the what many would suggest the depravity of modern people. So, chapter 2. He starts this by going more into depth on the left versus right narrative. So, essentially, what he says is that there are two different forms of the same thing. You know, the left is associated with the form, and the right is associated with tradition. And they're usually thought of complete opposites, you know, conservative, progressive, Republican, Democrat, what have you, but they essentially have the same end. They both want to expand the liberal ideology. Um, both sides do differ in some ways, though, and that's namely the means of achieving this end. You know, the left wants to, or the progressives want to expand liberalism through the state, whereas the right whereas the right does with the economy. Um, but they both want to, in a sense, liberate the individual by destroying local institutions and natural limits. You know, the market can do that, as can the state. So he goes into classical liberalism first, and he starts off by noting that what they essentially believe is that liberty is to allow for the pursuit and satisfaction of worldly desires, and that government is an unnatural limit to this. And this goes into the social contract theory, you know, of Hobbes and then of Locke. And, you know, it says, you know, we enter into contract to better survive, to secure liberty, which, you know, extends to the purpose of law. The liberal creates the state, while the state also creates the individual by controlling the conditions for enlargement of freedom. You know, it controls the circumstance. It's very reciprocal in that manner. Liberation from desires is also a major focus, meaning that the way one becomes free is through commerce, which allows for the acquisition of material goods to quench desires. It's a very materialistic way of thinking. And just like noted earlier, it's also universalist. So it desires to liberate others as well. And with classical liberalism, that is, again, through the market. And the market has changed under classical liberalism. So the market, when they used to be a physical place where you would interact with people socially to exchange currency for goods, it's now become abstract and impersonal. It's now more of an abstract idea. Your labor and goods just essentially become a commodity subject to the economy. It's more or less utilitarian. It serves the end of limiting relationships by seeing the individual as just that, you know, consumers who are separate from each other. And traditional values also is something he touches on in this chapter. But with classical liberals, he says they essentially just pay lip service to it. It's not really supported by conservatives, and not only that, but they support the free market, which essentially destroys such values. And then he touches on progressive liberals. He brings in a few key figures here, such as John Dewey and the call for a social whole, Herbert Croly, and his idea of the New Republic, which would be like a democracy not based on individualism, but a set of commitments to help recognize the brotherhood of mankind. And also Walter Rauschenbusch, probably butchered that last name, and his idea of a kingdom of God on earth, you know, a democracy set upon improving human nature. He gives special attention to both Dewey and Crowley. They essentially want to reconcile the social nature of man and individuality. And individualism is a key part of liberalism. And Another thing he points out, another specific event or thing in, yeah, event that he points out is has to do with the state creation of the individual. And the example he gives is The Life of Julia. And this was kind of a campaign piece for the Obama campaign. And it's a fictional female that essentially was off to a bad start, but government programs allowed her to fulfill her dreams. So this is essentially an idea of the state and the individual. It's a theme from Leviathan, except the opposite occurs, he notes. Instead of the individual creating the state creates the individual. He then goes on to discuss social isolation. There's an increased amount of isolation and alienation, which leads to an increase in the attractiveness of totalitarianism. He mentions Robert A. Nisbet and The Quest for Community, a book written by him. And Robert Nisbet notes that as social institutions and communities are being dissolved, a sense of alienization is being created, and this leads to a violent reaction against this aloneness by a turn towards statism. And the state is then the only legitimate group left that people can, really see. So people will inevitably turn to that. Individuality creates a natural recourse to the state in times of need instead of local institutions. They can't rely on their fellows, so they rely on the state instead. Local institutions are heavily damaged by liberalism, so they're not going to rely on them. They're going to rely on the strong state that is taking the place of those institutions. And he notes that, and he ends this chapter by noting that it's essentially a vicious cycle. State expansion allows for more individualism, which in turn requires more state to control the individuals with no common social norms or beliefs. So in chapter 3, he starts off by describing liberalism as not so much of a culture as it is an anti-culture. Its goal is to destroy local cultures by replacing them with liberalism, which you could essentially see as a form of colonization. You don't belong to your culture. The only thing that everyone really belongs to is the global market. And he points out 3 pillars of the anti-culture of liberalism. One is conquering nature. 2 is isolating people to the present, essentially. And 3 is making place meaningless. So, conquering nature. He talks about, not talks about, he brings in Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Hobbes, and their idea that for the natural man, there was essentially no culture. Now, before the advent of liberalism, he notes that culture was necessary for man's best potential. This is what people believed. People believed culture was necessary, and he makes an analogy to plants, to agriculture. Plants need cultivation, and cultivation, culture, it's the same stem of the word, right? It makes people better. The cultivation of virtue, culture allows people to become better, just like cultivating a plant allows it to grow. He brings in Aristotle as well, and his idea of food and sex. Manners keep consumption in check, and the same concept for courtship, marriage, and sex. It's essentially restraint. Culture puts certain restraints on overindulgence that would be destructive. And then Professor Dean goes into how liberalism prefers law to culture. And he talks about legalism later, but we won't cover that now. And he notes that culture is convention. It's how we interact with nature. And he gives a great example of our interaction with nature by pointing out industrialized agriculture. Now, industrialized agriculture is a liberal model, and it really shows the contrasting nature of working with nature and working against it. So, Industrialized agriculture works against nature. It's a very cold mechanical process where it's essentially forcing the goods from the earth as opposed to what it used to be, what regular agriculture used to be, where it was working with nature. You know, it was working with nature as opposed to massive machines essentially forcing crops from the ground, GMOs, etc. And say what you want about agriculture, but it's a great example to illustrate our our relationship with nature. And then he brings in John Dewey, and who believed that you should control nature to get rid of limiting beliefs. And he brings up the idea of the savage versus civilized people. He ends this part by noting that ultimately culture helps us to define the limits of nature and therefore is contradictory to liberalism. Next, he talks about the timelessness that liberalism tries to impart on us. So liberalism does what he says at least is that it tries to focus solely on the present. It wants to ignore the past, including the cultures and traditions tied to the past, and it wants us to have apathy for the future. It doesn't want us to really care about what happens in the future, and it's the mentality of leave the mess for your children. And a good example of this would be the environmental crisis. Why deal with it now when we can just leave it for our kids? And he brings in de Tocqueville. I'm sure you've heard of him. De Tocqueville talks about aristocracy. Aristocracy links generations together in a long chain, including the traditions and obligations tied to future generations and past generations, whereas democracy breaks this link. It focuses on the present generation. It focuses on short-term actions, presentism, if you will. And presentism encourages the pursuit of baser desires. And while democracy likes to think of it as replacing aristocracy, it's really only replacing a territorial aristocracy with a more distant industrial aristocracy. At least that's what de Tocqueville says. And then he goes into saying that Deneen goes into saying that culture connects timelines. And a good example he brings up is the Greek muse Mnemosyne. Probably butchered that too, but her name essentially means memory, and the muses were essentially the goddesses of culture. Memory was like a very important aspect of culture, and because it preserved inheritances, it preserved your heritage. It's vital. Memory is vital to the preservation of culture. Then he goes into talking about the placelessness that liberalism tries to impart. Essentially, liberalism tries to say that we are all homeless. We're from no one and nowhere, and that means we have no obligations to where we were raised. It's that reoccurring theme of maximizing license. He brings in Wendell Berry, and Wendell Berry talks about the importance of community. Community allows people to flourish. He notes about the enforcement of moral norms and how that's beneficial because it creates a moral ecology that's really good for a community. And Wendell Berry also believes that common good is best in local settings, which differs from liberalism, because liberalism prioritizes the larger unit over that of the smaller unit, as Wendell Berry believes otherwise. And he also mentions the sensus communis, the common knowledge, which is essentially accumulated knowledge by a group of people over time. And he also points out the importance of common sense, which he defines as just understanding the world through non-expert experience. And then Professor Deneen goes into discussing a mono-anti-culture, which is how he describes liberalism. And he brings in Solzhenitsyn, who talks about legalism. And legalism is essentially pushing the envelope of the pursuit of desires while still remaining in the law. it's trying to limit self-restraint as much as possible without actually breaking the law. Deneen then goes into discussing the educational desire to undermine economic and sexual norms, mostly in the college environment. It talks about the sexual revolution and carnal lust. He also talks about how college is used to guide students morally in loco parentis. Oftentimes there would be clergy there to give moral structure to students, but that is largely disappeared. That's almost entirely gone in the modern era, and this lack of authority causes anarchy and confusion, and it aids in the rise of the paternalist state in absentia parentis. And in all this anarchy, people have no one to turn to, and therefore turn to the state to save them. He brings an example of the 2008 failure of the economy. I had a little bit of trouble understanding this reference. It's just me. I'm not big into economics, but essentially, the bank. I believe he's trying to say is the banks ignored cultural norms, and this ultimately led to the failure of the economy in 2008. Then on other points, he points out the connection with loss of culture and the consumption of mass-produced goods, and popular culture falls into this category. And then he also discusses multiculturalism, how multiculturalism, in essence, doesn't celebrate any cultures at all. It's at best lip service, because if you celebrate all, you celebrate none. You're not really focusing on any specific culture. It's just, hey, let's celebrate all of them. And this is also, in essence, homogeneity, right? The idea, hey, we should celebrate all of these. The unified call for multiculturalism is homogenous. All right, so chapter 4. This chapter is mostly about technology, and he starts it by talking about the modern focus of technology, and does actually go into a bit of detail about our fear of technology. We have a lot of these, movies, right, like the Terminator, where Skynet takes over, and he discusses these fears. But then he goes into the internet, and he starts to talk about how the internet is essentially changing us as people, like almost on a biological level. He brings in Nicholas Carr, who would say that the internet is making us dumber, and then he also brings in Sherry Turkle in her piece "Alone Together," which she describes as a substitution for real life communities via the internet, and now this isn't working because community requires physical proximity. He then brings in Neil Postman, who had this idea of a technopoly, and technocracy is something that he discusses where modern tools attack culture. And this is something unique because this didn't happen in the past. In the past, cultural groups would use tools, but you've never had a tool that would attack the culture, and like the internet does, like social media does. It's trying to become a culture. A technopoly. Internet is trying to become our culture. Technopoly, and hence the name of the piece that he's referencing here by Mr. Postman. Postman is quoted as defining technopoly as, quote, the submission of all forms of cultural life to the sovereignty of technique and technology, unquote. And then he goes into technological inevitability, which is essentially the idea that technology is going to develop alongside the advancement of society, kind of regardless. And he brings in a few people who talk about this, Robert Heilbronner and Daniel J. Boorstin specifically. And then he goes on to discussing the reciprocity of virtuous people and polity. So the way he basically sets this up is that polity supports virtuous individuals who contribute to the polity. And that's kind of the traditional way of viewing it, right? The polity would help cultivate virtues in people who would be able to then better contribute back to society, to the polity. And then he also discusses autonomy versus freedom from enslavement to base desires, and this is a key point because people think that autonomy is essentially freedom when he notes that that's not the case. Because if you can do whatever you want, you're gonna just try to fulfill your base desires, in which case you're gonna essentially become enslaved to them. You become a slave to your own desires, and that's not freedom. Whereas if you become virtuous, you can experience freedom from those base desires. He also talks a little bit about the U.S. Constitution and the idea of ambition to counteract ambition and the enlarged orbit. So to increase ambition and make relationships more strained so as to discourage faction, the mistrust of motives. And then technology, he covers more in technology, and technology shapes us, and politics shapes technology. He talks about Stephen Marsh in his article from The Atlantic, Is Facebook Making Us Lonely? And he points out a key relationship between Facebook and the American sense of independence. He also brings in Richard Thomas in his piece From Porch to Patio, which seems more or less insignificant, but it actually does bring out a key concept. So people used to have a porch out in front of their house. It was almost like a social area, you'd say, right? But then they moved away from that, and now they have a patio in the back, secluded in their own backyard. And then, interesting enough, he brings in the Amish, and this is a part that I found really interesting. The Amish had a extraordinarily strong sense of community, and an interesting thing he points out is that the Amish a lot of times don't allow insurance. And you might think, well, that's an issue. What happens if a house falls down or someone gets sick? Well, in the Amish communities, if someone's barn falls down, the entire community gathers together to rebuild that barn. If someone gets sick, someone else takes care of them. It's that sense of community where they can work, they can help each other. You don't need insurance to do that. And Professor Deneen points out that ironically, we have less control over the technology we adopt, even though it is in the quest for more autonomy, which is, again, ironic. And he notes Daniel Borstein, who points out that we don't have control over the technology that rises to expand a system that we can't control either. We're really in a position of powerlessness. All right, so chapter 5. This is where he mainly discusses the liberal arts, and he starts out by saying, as far as liberal arts go, our education has become cultureless. Instead of learning to become free through virtue and cultivation, liberalism teaches that we are born free, essentially nullifying the need to study liberal arts. There is the great increased focus on STEM and economics and business. Liberal arts basically teaches us to use reason and spirit to cultivate virtue, that we be made free. So the liberal arts, therefore, help make us free. This is contradictory to the liberal position where, we're born free, so that obviously doesn't mesh with it. And there's the idea that virtue guards democracy. He quotes Mirabeau Lamar, who's the second president of Texas. He says, quote, "A cultivated mind is the guardian genius of democracy, and, while guided and controlled by virtue, the noblest attribute of man. It is the only dictator that freemen acknowledge and the only security that freemen desire." Unquote. So he also goes on to talk about the misuse of liberty due to a lack of restraint. People aren't practicing self-restraint when it comes to trying to fulfill their base desires, so there's a misuse of liberty that's naturally a consequence of that. And he points out, liberal arts are important because to be free is an art. It's not a science. It's not, type in some code or, get a certain mathematical calculation right and you'll be free. No, it's an art form. It's different for different people, and it needs to be, explored accordingly. So he also points out, hey, the religious aspects of universities were discarded, and the humanities are now without that religious aspect, which is very problematic because a lot of these, I guess, humanities have a religious background. A lot of the philosophies, theologies, it's religious in its background. And now liberal education is seen as useless, as liberty is no longer understood to be secured through virtue, but instead through military, technological, and other means instead. Brings up Clark Kerr in his piece, The Uses of the University, and he brings up an idea of a multiversity, a university geared towards providing useful info to industrial and military needs of the nation so that it can expand mastery over the world. And it's an interesting concept. And then Professor Dean goes into exploring that morality is no longer cared about when finding a job. Progress is seen more important than virtue, and students feel that it must take more practical courses because help them find jobs. It's very focused on that resume. Saying, hey, I'm a philosophy major isn't going to look really good when you're trying to find a job that's going to pay the bills. So they're going to go for something practical like engineering, something in STEM. And the great books are also not being studied so much as they are being attacked, because there's an emphasis on progressive knowledge. They try to look at the flaws of the way of thinking for the time. It's often seen as maybe, sexist or racist, and that's a big point that he brings up. And then he talks about postmodernism and rationalist scientism, and how they're seemingly opponents, but they both conform to the liberal idea of freedom. And out of this, there's the radical emancipatory theory, which focuses on oppression for things relating to the physical body, although for some reason not ethnic and class groups. It doesn't really care about those. And ultimately, this emancipatory theory wants to destroy hierarchy. And then he comments further on the increasing homogeneity, and as mentioned a little bit earlier, it's because of this universal call for diversification. It's being the fact that it is universal, and just saying and diversification, similar to multiculturalism, it doesn't really celebrate any specific group, so it's increasingly homogenous. The path to freedom ironically leads to slavery, because you cannot ultimately satiate the desires of man when there are limited resources available in the world. Ultimately, total freedom will lead to our destruction of society. There's the idea that appetite justifies consumption, which people believe they could consume without limits, and this is false. There's limits to the resources available, and if you consume without limits, you're eventually going to fall into ruin. Then there's the purpose of college education, which was originally, people would learn liberal arts. They would teach them about the traditions they came from and their heritage, and then they'd return to the town and enrich it, which obviously isn't happening. And he talks a little bit about this later. So, Chapter 6, college students. They're focusing on upward mobility majors. They want to do better. They want to reach higher social statuses, so they are going to take more practical majors, things in the STEM fields. And he brings up this idea of intellectual strip mining. People are taken from all over the country who have, who are probably, show some promise, and then they're sent to where they'll be most productive. And the people that are left behind in these towns are static in terms of class mobility. And he talks about how credentials ultimately determine one's status in society. He notes something that's peculiar, what he calls servile education. Back earlier, hundreds of years ago, it was the lower classes that would learn STEM because they needed it to provide for the family, whereas the upper classes who could afford to take time to learn about the arts would learn liberal arts. It would be for them. But nowadays at college, you have cooperative skills so that allow you to gain advantage over those who aren't in an elite. And it's really this environment that even puts people in the mindset where personal relationships are like alliances. It's for personal advantage. Everything is essentially for personal advantage. And then another thing he comments on is a new aristocracy. So it's an aristocracy not of inheritance, but of choice and talent, opportunity and industry. There are essentially two types of people, and he uses John Locke's second treatise of government to describe these two types of people. And so there is the industrious and rational people, and then there's the querulous and contentious people. And Locke went into quite an amount of detail when discussing this, but he noted that these two types of people could not be told apart in a subsistence economy because everyone is just getting what they can to survive, and so that you really couldn't tell the difference because both of them were just focused on survival. So what Locke suggested is that we replace the querulous and contentious rulers with those who are industrious and rational, a new aristocracy. And this was viewed as a natural aristocracy. But it's also essentially the same as the old aristocracy. It's just an aristocracy of economic prosperity. And the lower classes are left there but pacified by materialism and an illusion of class mobility, which really doesn't exist. He also brings in Friedrich Hayek, who talks about the rapid economic advance and how that encourages inequality. Because society, if it's advancing rapidly, it must do it in what he describes as an echelon fashion. Then he also brings in Tyler Cowen, who is essentially describes a place where that's basically like Brave New World, right? Cheap housing, free internet. It's kind of like a Soma, if you will. It's probably not the best analogy, but you get what I mean. Another thing that he brings in is the idea of an oppressive public opinion. So he uses John Stuart Mill, who notes that public opinion is more oppressive than law. Mill also believed that society ought to be remade for the individual few of intellectual genius, who are, in a sense, the most individual. And then there's contrasted with Burke, who instead believes of benefiting the many ordinary as opposed to the few. And there are societal norms that everyone is to follow, regardless of the social standing. And again, he contrasts Mill and Burke as the new versus the old way of thinking. Older America was Burkean, whereas newer America, more or less follows along the lines of Mill. And then he talks about class stagnation, which is very prevalent. People from good towns do well, and people from bad towns don't do well. An example of this is Charles Murray, Fishtown and Belmont. Fishtown is essentially this rundown, shabby town where people don't do well, and then Belmont is this great upper class, upstanding town where there isn't a lot of divorce, children are doing well, parents are doing well, families are doing great. The exact opposite of Fishtown. And Murray believes that Belmont just needs to preach what it is doing to Fishtown, and Fishtown will eventually learn and do better. And that's contrasted with Robert Putnam, who believes that more social programs would to help those in need would be a better option. But then Professor Deneen notes that both of these people are missing the point, that this is because of liberalism's successes, not its failure. And then he talks about another concept about the secession of the successful. The elites, the highly educated, are withdrawn to concentrated areas, wealthy neighborhoods, instead of being mixed in with the general population of a country. And along with this idea of the secession of the successful, there's an idea of a new servant class. Nannies and gardeners, as well as tutors, perpetuate liberal restructuring of the family. And then he goes on to further add to the whole liberal, classical liberal versus progressive liberals idea, where they claim to both be in battle, but they both advance liberalism as a whole. Again, liberalism is advanced by both the market and the state. They're essentially both aiding each other in achieving the same end, that is the advancement of liberalism as a whole. And then he brings in, at the end of this chapter, Plato's noble lie. Laborers essentially believe they can advance when it is really not the case, and the aristocracy, the new aristocracy, believes that they are the opposite of just that. They think that they replaced the old aristocracy. They are no longer a part of it, but they are the same. All right, so chapter 7. Liberal democracy is essentially the opposite of democracy, where people who do not rule are pacified with material goods and security. This is really where he starts attacking democracy in itself. And he brings in the idea of an illiberal democracy. So the ancient thinkers despised democracy, notably Aristotle and Plato. And Deneen brings in Jason Brennan, who calls for an epistocracy, rule by those who are capable of ruling a liberal state. And again, Deneen notes that people are not guided by knowledge, but make impulsive decisions based on whims and emotions. And recently there's been a low amount of democratic competence. People aren't doing what is best for their country on average, the mass populace. Democracy is essentially an expression of popular preference. And people don't trust the electorate in the United States, which is a problem because that's how the country is essentially set up. He notes that the founding fathers did not want a democracy. Madison wanted a chosen body of citizens representing the rest. Those who recognized the power is not in their hands would just pursue private interests. Again, the idea that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. That's a key point from the Federalist Papers that he brings up. Citizens do not trust each other. That's a great way to stop factionalism, the rise of faction. If you don't trust people and their motives, why would you join them in such a cause? And instead, they're focused on self-interest, ambition, private interests, and distance, which creates distance, I should say. And then he notes a little bit about mass democracy, which keeps the populace from popular rule, which is ironic, I would say. It's the promotion of good policy as well, and good policy being that which promotes economic and political strength and the expansion of power. And then Professor Deneen touches a little bit on foreign affairs, and essentially, the United States is a commercial republic, and that is an enticing target for enemies, because enemies want prosperity. Commercial republics are prosperous, so prosperity must be defended. And then he goes into an interesting point on centralized authority. Now, people will side with whatever is closest, which would be local authority, unless there is something that is more efficient, in which case they'll side with that which is more efficient. Central government is more effective because it attracts those men who have a natural taste and talent for running a state, to a degree far larger than local governments can. And then he brings in de Tocqueville again, who talks about the difference between license and liberty, which we talked about earlier, and that democracy requires morality, which again we talked about earlier, and that local community strength is very important, which, yes, is true. Then he ends this chapter with the potential, with bringing up the idea that there's a potential for autocratic strongmen to step in to save people from liberalism. Where the country is heading, it could be it's very well possible that authoritarianism could be on the rise and it would be just accepted by democratic population. So in conclusion, the conclusion of the book, liberalism is ending. There's the potential for an authoritarian replacement. So Professor Deneen has a call to action. And this call to action there's three parts. A, there's no going back. You can't look, you should use the past, but you can't just turn entirely to the past. We must go forward. B, we need to step away from ideology. It's caused a lot of damage. We need to just remove ourselves from it. And we also have to recognize liberalism's achievements in, for example, justice and human dignity. Those are great things that liberalism has done. So on the idea of only moving forward, you do have to appreciate liberalism. It's done good things. You need to work with the past, but you need to move forward. There was the issue of a disconnect with ideals and practices that he brings up, and he also brings up corporate bondage in this part. You know, people often think of, well, hey, people like women shouldn't be, reserved for just staying in the house, right? They should be able to go out and get a job. And he notes that, hey, working for a company is essentially no different. It's a type of servitude, corporate bondage. So then on the idea of moving away from ideology, he thinks we need to move away from this fiction of consent. The idea of consent that liberalism is infatuated with. And then there's the new birth of theory. People are longing for lost culture. So culture must be rebuilt. And there's many ways to do this. One important way he brings up is developing a home economy, because there's the idea of people are choosing convenience over actually learning skills. Why learn to, I don't know, cook your food when you can just microwave a pre-made meal? That's more convenient, so you should do that. But Professor Deneen is suggesting that you should develop a home economy. You should learn those skills. It is a key part of culture. And then he brings in de Tocqueville again, who talks about how local township government is the schoolhouse of democracy. Obviously an appeal to local government, local affairs. So, and then he ends the book with saying that we don't need a better theory, we need better practice. And that's Why Liberalism Has Failed by Patrick J. Deneen. I thought it was a great book. It had some very compelling arguments. So I think you guys should definitely check out the book and read it for yourself, because I only gave you a snapshot of the book, and I can guarantee I had some errors in what I was saying, probably from misunderstanding or something. So I would highly suggest reading it. I'll put a link in the description to where you can get it. And if you made it this far, well, kudos to you, and thanks for watching.